Historians have never begrudged Richard of Shrewsbury his own life. Yet whenever the second son of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville is discussed, two topics dominate the conversation, subjects about which we can say little with certainty. The princes in the Tower and Perkin Warbeck. I am not innocent myself by choosing this title. I wanted to make it clear who I am here to talk about today. Welcome back to Lemmy History. This video wasn't planned. As many of you already know, a series on Elizabeth of York and her Aunt Margaret is currently in the works. During my research, I came across connections between several figures in Richard, which sparked a realization. Richard was a living, breathing boy, and he deserves to be discussed beyond just his early marriage and the 6 weeks he spent in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. I also want to explore the world that could have been. However, I must acknowledge that much of what I present will be an interpretation of circumstantial evidence. One thing I will not cover in this video is Warbeck, or the possible survival of Richard and his brother. I have already explored these topics extensively. Rest assured, we will revisit Warbeck soon. The same goes for Richard's brother. My goal today is to focus entirely on Richard, though I may not succeed completely, thanks in part to the aunt of Richard's wife, Anne. After all, she was the woman with whom Richard's father, Edward IV, allegedly had a pre-contract for marriage. We will discuss the implications of Edward IV marrying his son into this family toward the end of the video. A certain level of prior knowledge about Richard's life will be necessary to engage in this discussion meaningfully. Richard was born in August 1473 at the monastery of Shrewsbury, a fact that led to his designation as Richard of Shrewsbury. His exact birth date is recorded as August 17, 1473, though this is not entirely certain. As mentioned earlier, Richard was the second son of his parents, but their sixth child overall. 4 of his older siblings were still alive. Only his sister Margaret had passed away on December 11, 1472. Notably, Richard was born almost exactly 9 months after his sister's death, leading to speculation that he may have been slightly premature. This theory is further supported by his birthplace, which appears to have been chosen as an emergency solution. Richard was named after his grandfather, but it is possible that his name also reflected a degree of appreciation for his uncle. Unlike his father, Edward IV chose not to name his second son George, perhaps influenced by the strained relationship between Edward and his brother George, Duke of Clarence, in previous years. Unfortunately, we do not know Richard's godfather, making it difficult to draw definitive conclusions. However, we do know that Edward later named another son George, though the boy did not live long. Before Richard could even walk, he was already one of the most powerful men in England. On March 28, 1474, his father created him Duke of York, thus reinforcing the tradition that the monarch's second son would inherit this title. The very next day, he was also appointed a Knight of the Garter. Over the following years, he accumulated extensive lands and titles, including estates in Suffolk, the Duchy of Lancaster, and Wales. On June 12, 1476, he was granted the title of Earl of Nottingham. In 1477, Richard's prospects grew even further. When Anne Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, died at the age of 32, his young daughter Anne became his sole heir. Like Richard, she was still a toddler. Seizing the opportunity, Edward IV arranged his son's betrothal to the wealthy heiress and went so far as to push through their marriage a year later. The wedding took place on January 15, 1478, in St. Stephen's Chapel at Westminster, when the bride and groom were just 4 and 5 years old. Under the law at the time, the marriage could later be annulled if necessary. For the moment, however, Edward IV had secured the vast Mowbray inheritance for his son, and by extension, for himself. To solidify this, he had already granted Richard the titles of Duke of Norfolk and Earl of Warren on February 7, 1478. The wedding may have been the last time Richard saw his older brother until 1483. The redistribution of these honours bypassed John Howard and William Viscount Berkeley, both of whom had strong claims to the Mowbray inheritance. Their situation worsened after Anne's death on November 8, 1481. Edward IV enacted a law ensuring that her estates would pass directly to Richard and his descendants. In compensation, Edward settled some of Berkeley's outstanding debts, but Howard received nothing, despite his unwavering loyalty to the House of York. Unlike his older brother Edward V, Richard was not sent to a separate household at an early age, but remained with the royal family. 2 possible explanations exist for this. First, his father may have kept him close due to the sheer importance of his inheritance. Second, the household designated for him may not have been ready yet. I lean toward the latter explanation, but that will be explored further in the next part of this video. Richard also held an important political role. He was appointed Lieutenant of Ireland, a position his father extended for 12 years in 1480. Initially, John de la Pole had administered this office on his behalf, following the execution of Richard's uncle George. Since Richard was still too young to govern, a deputy was needed. Henry Grey, 4th Baron Grey of Codner, was originally selected for the role, but local resistance proved too strong, forcing Edward IV to appoint Gerald Fitzgerald, 8th Earl of Kildare, instead. Tragedy struck on April 9, 1483, when Richard's father died. It remains unclear whether Richard was present at his father's deathbed, or whether Edward IV gave specific instructions regarding his younger son's guardianship. What we do know is that, following Edward's death, Elizabeth Woodville fled with her daughters and Richard into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey on May 1, 1483. According to the Stoner letters, Richard remained there until June 16th, when he was handed over to his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to be reunited with his brother. An intriguing passage from Polydore Virgil, one that even Ricardians accept as credible, suggests that the Duke of Gloucester claimed his nephew had been unhappy living in sanctuary and preferred to be with his brother Edward in the Tower, where he could play a role in the upcoming coronation. This raises the question of how the future Richard III would have known the boy's state of mind. In the Privy Council, Gloucester also argued that it would reflect poorly on the coronation if the younger prince were absent. However, there is an issue of timing. Allegedly, on June 9th, before Richard left sanctuary, Bishop Robert Stillington informed the Lords about Edward IV's pre-contract, which called into question the legitimacy of both of his sons. Given that this was a semi-public revelation, news of it should have spread rapidly, yet Richard of Shrewsbury was still sent to the Tower a week later. This inconsistency remains a point of debate. Regardless of the political turmoil, we learn the most about Richard of Shrewsbury's character from his time in the Tower. According to Dominic Mancini, citing John Argentine, Richard was a cheerful boy with a desire to learn how to dance. This aligns with later accounts from Perkin Warbeck's era, which suggest that Richard had a keen interest in music and was a talented singer. I also came across an unverified reference in the literature suggesting that Richard was skilled in handling sticks and swords. However, as no source is cited, this claim must be treated with caution. All surviving accounts indicate that Richard enjoyed good health throughout his life. One chronicle even states that he was seen practicing archery in the Tower alongside his brother, which suggests this was part of his previous training, if the report is accurate. But what was the plan for the world that could have been? What were Edward IV's ambitions for his son? As we can see, the king bestowed upon Richard of Shrewsbury numerous titles and vast possessions. Had history taken a different course, Richard would have been the most powerful magnate in his brother's kingdom, and in my view, that was precisely the intention. Edward IV structured his second reign around two dominant power blocks within the nobility. In the north, his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, ruled on his behalf. In Wales, the Woodvilles, particularly Anthony, Earl Rivers, the Queen's brother and guardian of Edward V, held considerable influence. Both men wielded extensive authority, though Gloucester was even more powerful. I suspect that Edward V was meant to govern much like his father, relying heavily on his brother's support. However, Edward IV appears to have left his son the flexibility to determine where Richard of Shrewsbury would serve. By granting Richard extensive estates and titles across Wales, the north, and the east of England, the king ensured that his younger son had a solid foundation in multiple regions from which to build his power. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had a son of his own, Edward of Middleham. It is easy to imagine that Edward IV did not want to commit too early to the idea of making his younger son his brother's successor. However, several clues suggest that this was indeed his long-term plan. One such clue appears on August 20th, 1480, when the two Richards, Gloucester and Shrewsbury, appear together as witnesses to a charter. The other witnesses were Chancellor of England Thomas Rotherham, Earl Rivers, the Earl of Essex, Thomas Stanley, and William Hastings, some of the most prominent men in the realm. The charter, which pertained to Southampton, suggests that Edward IV was not looking to establish a single dominant figure in the region, but instead favored a cooperative approach in the south. Notably absent from the list of witnesses was Thomas Grey, Marquess of Dorset. Further evidence can be found among the members of Richard of Shrewsbury's household, several of whom later became trusted figures under Richard III. Two notable examples are Thomas Galmole, active in Ireland, and Richard Southwell. The fact that Richard III confirmed Galmole's position so early in his reign suggests that he had prior knowledge of and trust in him. That said, for the sake of completeness, it is important to acknowledge that Edward IV also appointed some Woodville loyalists to serve his younger son. One such figure was Richard Hort, who managed Richard's affairs in Wales. Richard III, however, had no use for these Woodville retainers, though we will encounter them again when discussing Elizabeth of York and Margaret of York. I believe that Richard of Shrewsbury was eventually meant to enter the household of his paternal uncle. Few barons were influential enough for Edward IV to entrust with his son's upbringing. John Howard, for instance, had been slighted by the king over the Mowbray inheritance, making it unlikely that Edward would have placed Richard, its beneficiary, under his care. William Hastings remained in London with the king, while Rivers was in Wales overseeing Edward's other son. Moreover, on his deathbed, Edward IV appointed his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector, a clear indication that he trusted him with the new king's welfare. Given this, it seems highly probable that Edward would have also entrusted his youngest son to Gloucester's guardianship without hesitation. This could explain why Richard of Shrewsbury had not yet been sent north. At the beginning of the 1480s, Gloucester was deeply engaged in the war against Scotland, and the border situation remained unstable. Had conditions later stabilized and Edward IV lived, I believe Richard of Shrewsbury would have eventually been sent to Middleham. However, this is only my interpretation, as no existing source confirms it outright. Even more speculative is my opinion on what Edward IV intended for his younger son once he realized his own death was imminent. It is well known that the Woodvilles would have preferred Rivers as Lord Protector instead of Gloucester. Edward IV also knew that Richard of Shrewsbury would hold the title of Prince of Wales for some time, as Edward V would not be having children in the near future. My speculation is that Rivers was meant to continue overseeing Richard of Shrewsbury at Ludlow, just as he had done for Edward V. His tenure there had never been subject to criticism from any quarter, and Edward IV likely intended for him to continue in that role. The fact that events unfolded differently may have been influenced by Richard of Shrewsbury's mother-in-law. Anne Mowbray's mother, Elizabeth de Mowbray, was the sister of Eleanor Talbot, who died in 1468. At the time of her sister's death, Elizabeth was 26 years old. If there had been a preliminary marriage contract between Eleanor and Edward IV, Elizabeth may have known about it, although she herself had been married as a child. She lived well into the 16th century, yet as far as we know, she was never consulted about the alleged contract. Interestingly, there is speculation that Elizabeth de Mowbray may have pressured Edward IV to exclude John Howard and William Viscount Berkeley from the line of succession. This could explain why the king overlooked these loyal supporters. If Elizabeth was aware of the preliminary contract between Edward IV and Eleanor Butler, this knowledge may have given her the leverage to insist on such exclusions. However, Richard's marriage to Anne Mowbray is also seen as a counter-argument to the idea that Elizabeth knew about the contract, if it existed. Would she really have agreed to her daughter's marriage to a potentially illegitimate son of the king? And would Edward IV have pushed for his son to marry into this family if there was a risk that the bride's mother knew his most damning secret? I don't have definitive answers to these questions either, but one thing is certain. Richard's life was full of mysteries long before June 16th, 1483. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to support my channel.